A mother's lullaby in the dim light of a nursery, a gentle hand rocking a cradle, a soft kiss on a sleeping infant's forehead. These are the timeless images of care, of safety, of a love so pure it seems to hold the world at bay. But in the quiet, gaslit homes of Victorian England, that gentle hand often held a spoon, and the lullaby was sometimes followed by the bitter taste of a dark, sweet liquid. It was a liquid that promised peace, but delivered a silence that, for thousands of children, would last forever. They were not monsters, these women. They were mothers following the advice of doctors, trusting the cheerful labels on bottles, and doing what they believed was best. Yet, in their quest to soothe and protect, they became the unknowing agents of a slow, creeping poison that entered the nursery disguised as medicine, as comfort, and even as love. Tonight, we will enter the shadowed world of the Victorian mother, a world where the line between care and cruelty was invisibly thin. We will uncover how the most trusted remedies and celebrated ideals of the age turned the act of mothering into an act of unknowing violence. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If one were to step into the modest homes of Victorian families, especially those without the means to hire help, the first thing one might hear would be the sound of a baby crying. It was the kind of persistent, high-pitched wail that echoed through tiny rooms and narrow alleyways. In families with several young children, the noise was nearly constant. The daily demands of childcare fell entirely on mothers, many of whom were young themselves, tired, and burdened by poverty. There were no nannies, no daycares, and little relief. The idea of peaceful rest, or even a moment of silence, often felt like a luxury out of reach. Inside these cramped spaces, the presence of a single fussy infant could quickly turn into a household crisis. Meals were delayed, older children went unattended, and the mother's own health declined under the strain. The more the child cried, the more helpless she felt. So when neighbors whispered about a miracle solution, a few drops that could make a baby quiet and calm, many listened. Laudanum was that solution. Sold cheaply at the corner chemist, it promised rest in liquid form, and in a world where noise meant chaos, quiet felt like a blessing. The medicine came in small glass bottles with handwritten labels. It looked harmless. The liquid was dark and bitter, but when mixed with a bit of water or syrup, it went down easily. A teaspoon was often enough for an adult. For infants, just a few drops. It is almost absurd that a drug containing a potent mixture of opium and alcohol was marketed as a parenting shortcut, but Victorian mothers embraced it without hesitation. They didn't think of it as dangerous. In their minds, it was simply medicine, something given to help a child rest, recover, and grow stronger. Pharmacists and shopkeepers recommended it freely. There were no prescriptions, no warnings printed on the bottles. The chemists who sold it often had no medical training, and neither did their customers. Word of mouth was the primary guide. If one mother found success with laudanum, others quickly followed. The dosage varied. Some used a few drops at night, others gave it before every nap. Some even used it during the day just to keep a child calm while chores were done. If it worked, it was used again and again. The relief it provided was real, at least at first. Children who had cried for hours would fall into a deep, unnatural sleep. They stopped wailing. They stopped fussing. The home grew quiet. The mother breathed easier. For many, this felt like a return to normal. But the silence carried a cost. The drug slowed the child's heartbeat, dulled the senses, and affected breathing. It was not always visible, especially in the beginning. But over time, the signs emerged. Some children became sluggish, others stopped eating properly. Their skin turned pale, their eyes dull. The problem was that no one made the connection. In Victorian society, illness and weakness in children were common. Malnutrition, infections, and poor sanitation caused countless deaths. When a child failed to thrive, laudanum was rarely blamed. It was considered helpful, not harmful. In today's terms, it would be like giving babies over-the-counter sleeping pills every night and calling it a gentle routine. No one questioned the wisdom behind the practice. There were no medical studies, no pediatric guidelines, only tradition and convenience. The pressure on mothers was relentless. Many had several children under the age of 5, often born in close succession. Their husbands worked long hours or were absent altogether. Help was minimal, and expectations were high. The idea that a small bottle could offer peace became irresistible. Even for those who hesitated, the voices around them were loud. Friends, midwives, and even shopkeepers suggested it as perfectly normal. And once tried, it was hard to stop. Some mothers kept bottles tucked in drawers or on shelves near the bed. Others wrapped them in cloth and carried them in their aprons. It became part of the daily rhythm. Crying led to dosing. Dosing led to sleep. Sleep led to quiet. Quiet meant survival. The homes remained poor. The air remained dirty. And the water remained unsafe. But at least the baby was not crying. That alone made laudanum feel like a gift. No one thought about addiction. No one thought about an overdose. The silence felt like success. The children, of course, couldn't speak of the drug. Many were too young to remember. Some never reached an age where they could explain how they felt. If they grew ill, it was seen as a weakness. If they died, it was seen as fate. Mothers mourned, then moved on. Life required it. The next child needed care. The next meal needed to be made. No one had time to examine the cause. The bottles were emptied and replaced. The cycle continued quietly. Inside thousands of homes across the country, doctors, when they were involved, rarely questioned the practice. In fact, some even encouraged it. They saw it as practical. With so many children and so few resources, laudanum helped keep things manageable. Fewer crying babies meant fewer desperate mothers. Hospitals and poorhouses were overcrowded already. Anything that kept children quiet and at home was considered useful. The broader cost was not measured. That would come later. Laudanum was not a hidden secret. It was openly sold, openly used, and openly accepted. It crossed all social boundaries, though the poor used it more often out of necessity. It was in homes, in shops, and in the minds of nearly every parent who struggled to get through the day. It soothed babies, calmed nerves, and made life feel manageable. But behind the calm was something far more dangerous. I cannot help but imagine how many mothers believed they were doing the right thing, only to carry the weight of that silence for the rest of their lives. They were not trying to harm their children. They were trying to survive, and survival in Victorian times often meant compromise. Laudanum was one such compromise. A few drops at night, a few more when the day grew hard, enough to bring rest, but sometimes enough to bring death. No one counted the exact number. No one wanted to. In a world where quiet was precious and exhaustion was endless, many Victorian mothers turned to laudanum as their only escape. The practice began in love, continued in routine, and often ended in tragedy. But the real horror began when companies realized they could sell this same drug directly to children in cheerful bottles and with names designed to comfort, turning a household remedy into an industrial-scale poison. The poison a mother gave her child was not always administered with a spoon. Sometimes, it was delivered through the most natural and intimate act of all, breastfeeding. A woman recovering from the ordeal of childbirth was often in a state of profound exhaustion and pain. Her body was healing, her hormones were in turmoil, and the demands of a newborn were relentless. Doctors, observing her fatigue and what they termed nervous sensitivity, turned again to their most trusted prescription, laudanum. A few drops they claimed would help the mother sleep, restore her nerves, and ease her discomfort. What they did not say, and perhaps did not even fully understand, was that the opium flowed from her body into her breast milk, reaching the very child who depended on her for nourishment. The practice was common and seldom questioned. A new mother, struggling with sleeplessness as her baby cried through the night, would be urged by relatives to rest. A spoonful of laudanum seemed like a blessing. She swallowed the bitter liquid, often mixed with syrup to mask the taste, closed her eyes, and drifted into a heavy, dreamless calm. When the child stirred for its feeding, she would lift the infant to her breast, without a second thought, never suspecting that the same substance that calmed her was now being passed into the tiny developing body of her newborn. It is grimly ironic that the act of nourishment, a symbol of life and maternal connection, became a channel for a narcotic that slowly weakened the child. Infants exposed to opium through breast milk began to show signs that families and even doctors tragically misunderstood. They slept for long, uninterrupted hours. They seemed unusually quiet and rarely fussed. At first, mothers welcomed this placid behavior, believing it was a sign that their babies were easy to care for, content and healthy. Only later did the more troubling problems emerge. The children often grew sluggish, refused to feed properly, and appeared weaker than other infants their age. Their skin might take on a pale, almost translucent quality, and their cries when they came were often weak and listless. Families would call them delicate or sickly, attributing their condition to a poor constitution, inherited weakness, or simply bad luck. In modern terms, it would be like a new mother being prescribed strong opioids for postpartum recovery, being told it's perfectly safe to breastfeed, and then everyone praising her for having such a good baby, because the infant is too sedated to cry. The disconnect between perception and reality was vast. The cycle often deepened, as doctors encouraged the mother's continued use of the drug. If a mother complained of difficulty nursing, she might be told to rest more. If she admitted to feeling anxious or overwhelmed, she was often prescribed a larger dose of laudanum. Each adjustment meant that her milk carried an even higher concentration of the drug. The infant's lethargy was not recognized as a symptom of poisoning, but was mistaken for temperament. Families congratulated themselves on having such quiet, manageable babies, not realizing that the silence was the unnatural stillness of sedation. Cases of infant decline began to appear in scattered medical records. Babies who failed to thrive, who wasted away despite being fed, or who succumbed to unexplained illnesses, were sometimes quietly linked to mothers who used laudanum heavily. Yet these connections were rarely acknowledged in public. To admit that a mother's milk had been poisoned by a prescribed drug was to admit a failure, not only of the family, but of the entire medical system. It was easier to let the death be recorded as marasmus or infant debility than to confront the truth. I find it heartbreaking to imagine these scenes: women cradling infants who slept too soundly, their small chests barely rising and falling, unaware of the reason for this profound quiet. The cruelest part is that these mothers were not careless. They were obedient. They trusted their doctor. They did what they were told was best for their own recovery, and by extension for their families. Their obedience, a celebrated Victorian virtue, became the very path of harm. In their desire to follow medical advice, they unwittingly passed the drug to the most vulnerable beings in their home. Servants and wet nurses sometimes observed the effects more clearly. A wet nurse, hired to care for an infant when a mother was too weak, might notice the stark difference between a child fed by a woman who took laudanum and one who did not. They saw the lethargy, the poor appetite, the strange vacant expressions, yet their voices carried little weight. To question a lady's medical routine was to overstep their station, a risk that could cost them their livelihood, and so their knowledge remained unspoken, a secret kept in the nurseries of the wealthy. The broader culture reinforced the practice. Advertisement for laudanum and other soothing syrups often included references to maternal care, showing serene women with healthy-looking children at their side. The message implied safety not only for the mother, but for the entire family. No mention was made of the danger to nursing infants. These images gave mothers the confidence that their actions were responsible and proper. The reality was the opposite. The children who survived this early exposure often carried long-term effects. They tended to grow more slowly, their bodies and minds weaker. Families would explain it away as an inherited weakness, never connecting it to the laudanum that had been present in their systems from their first days of life. The drug's influence extended across generations, its damage written into the bodies of children who were born into homes where obedience to medical advice was prized above all else. The silence around this practice was nearly absolute. Mothers did not speak of it, for they believed they were doing what was right. Doctors did not warn of it, for many did not fully acknowledge the risk. Families did not question it, for they trusted both authority and tradition. As a result, the smallest victims of laudanum remained invisible, their suffering erased by ignorance and denial. This chapter of laudanum's history shows its reach in the most intimate space of all, the bond between mother and child. It demonstrates how deeply the drug had penetrated the rhythms of Victorian life, shaping not only the lives of women, but also the lives of the children they brought into the world. The poison was not always in the bottle on the shelf. Sometimes it was in the very nourishment meant to give life. And while this invisible transfer of toxins occurred in the quiet of the nursery, another, more visible poison was being applied to women's faces, a poison that could be transferred with a simple loving kiss. The ideal of Victorian beauty was one of striking pallor. A woman's skin was expected to be as white and smooth as porcelain, a sign that she was a lady of leisure, untouched by the sun's coarsening rays. To achieve this look, women turned to a vast array of face powders, creams and lotion. These cosmetics were not the carefully tested products of today. They were often homemade or purchased from chemists, who mixed their formulas with little regard for safety. Many of these popular complexion whiteners contained toxic heavy metals, most commonly lead and arsenic. A woman would sit at her vanity each morning and dust her face, neck and arms with a fine white powder, creating a mask of pale refinement. She did this to appear beautiful, pure, and respectable. She was unknowingly painting her face with poison. When this woman, her face coated in a fine layer of lead carbonate, leaned down to kiss her child goodnight, she was not just offering affection, she was transferring a toxin directly to their skin. It is almost comical, in a deeply grim way, that a mother's kiss, the ultimate symbol of love and protection, could become a vehicle for lead poisoning. A child's skin is more absorbent than an adult's, and their small bodies are far more vulnerable to the effects of heavy metals. A trace of lead powder left on a cheek from a mother's kiss, or transferred to a baby's hands as they touched her face, would be absorbed into their system. This was not a one-time exposure, it was a daily ritual. Each kiss, each cuddle, each moment of physical closeness became an opportunity for the poison to pass from mother to child. The symptoms of slow lead poisoning in a child were subtle and often mistaken for other common ailments. Irritability, loss of appetite, stomach pain, and developmental delays were all signs. A child might become unusually cranky, or suddenly seem less intelligent than their peers. They might complain of headaches or seem clumsy and uncoordinated. In a time before the dangers of lead were widely understood, these symptoms were simply seen as evidence of a child's difficult temperament or weak constitution. No one thought to look at the mother's perfectly powdered face as the source of the problem. In modern terms, it would be like discovering that a popular brand of foundation contained mercury, and that mothers were unknowingly poisoning their children every time they held them close. The outrage would be immediate and universal. In the Victorian era, however, this silent poisoning continued for decades, hidden in plain sight. The mothers themselves were also victims. The lead and arsenic they applied daily were absorbed through their own skin, leading to chronic health problems like nerve damage, anemia, and kidney failure. They suffered from headaches, tremors, and a slow decline in health, all while being praised for their flawless complexion. The very thing that made them appear beautiful was slowly killing them from within. When they then passed that poison to their children, it was an extension of a tragedy they themselves were living. The culture of silence surrounding women's health made it impossible to connect the dots. A woman would never speak of the rashes or sores that sometimes appeared under her powder, and she certainly wouldn't link her child's persistent sickness to her own beauty routine. To do so would have been considered vain and improper. The home was meant to be a sanctuary of health and purity, and the mother was its guardian. The idea that she could be the source of her child's illness was a contradiction too terrible for most to contemplate. I find it unsettling to think of the invisible danger lurking in a mother's gentle touch. A hand stroking a feverish brow could be leaving behind a residue of arsenic. A kiss meant to comfort could be delivering a dose of lead. The intimacy of the mother-child bond became a conduit for harm, all because of the crushing societal pressure to achieve an artificial standard of beauty. These cosmetics were not just for the wealthy. Cheaper versions, often containing even higher levels of toxic metals, were sold in working-class neighborhoods. A factory worker, desperate to look respectable and hide the grime of her labor, might buy a cheap pot of whitening cream. When she came home and held her baby, she too was passing on the poison. The problem crossed class lines, affecting any child whose mother used these products. Servants who helped their mistresses apply these powders were also at risk, as were their own children if they lived in the same household. The dust from the powders would settle on surfaces throughout the home. In the nursery, on toys and on bedding, a child crawling on the floor could ingest lead particles without anyone ever noticing. The long-term effects on the children who survived were often profound. Lead poisoning in childhood can lead to permanent learning disabilities, behavioral problems, and a lower IQ. An entire generation of children may have grown up with their potential diminished by the cosmetics their mothers wore. They were not just physically poisoned, their very futures were subtly stolen from them, one loving, toxic kiss at a time. This was not a secret conspiracy. It was a widely accepted practice, celebrated in women's magazines and promoted by chemists. The pursuit of a pale complexion was seen as a virtuous endeavor, a mark of refinement. No one considered the price being paid by the children who were closest to that carefully constructed mask of beauty. The poison was not in a bottle of medicine, but in a pot of cream, not administered with a spoon, but with a mother's touch. And while this chemical poison seeped into the skin, another more pervasive poison was present in the very air and water of the Victorian home. A poison that mothers in their daily chores unknowingly served to their children every single day. The Victorian home, often idealized as a sanctuary of domestic peace and order, was in reality a battleground against invisible enemies. The poison that mothers gave to their children was not always manufactured in a factory or sold in a chemist's shop. Sometimes it was cultivated in their own kitchens and carried in the very water they used for drinking, cooking, and bathing. In an age before a full understanding of germ theory, the concepts of hygiene were based more on appearance and smell than on scientific reality. A home could look clean and smell of polish and yet be teeming with deadly bacteria. Mothers, as the keepers of the domestic sphere, were tasked with maintaining a healthy household, but they were armed with ignorance and superstition, making them unwitting agents of disease. The water supply in most Victorian cities was a contaminated soup. Pipes for fresh water often ran alongside sewers, and cross-contamination was rampant. Water drawn from a household tap or a public pump could contain traces of human waste, carrying with it the bacteria for cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. A mother, believing she was giving her child a nourishing drink, might be handing them a glass of water laced with pathogens. She would boil the water for tea, but often gave it to children cold, unaware that the invisible organisms within it could shut down a child's small body in a matter of days. It is almost absurd that a society so obsessed with moral purity and social etiquette was so comfortable with the literal filth that flowed through its pipes and streets. Mothers followed the cleaning rituals of the day, scrubbing floors with harsh lye soap and polishing furniture until it shone. But these actions did little to combat the microbial threat. They would wash vegetables in contaminated water, then serve them raw to their children. They would prepare milk-based puddings or broths in pots that were not properly sterilized, allowing bacteria to multiply. The poison here was not a chemical, but life itself, microscopic life that thrived in the conditions of the Victorian kitchen. When a child developed severe diarrhea and vomiting, the classic signs of cholera or gastroenteritis, it was often blamed on bad air, a change in the weather, or something the child had eaten that disagreed with them. The idea that the water from their own well or the milk from the local dairy was the source of the sickness was rarely considered. The mother would nurse the sick child diligently, wiping their brow with a cool cloth and offering them sips of the very water that was poisoning them, hoping to rehydrate them while unknowingly feeding the disease. In modern terms, it would be like trying to cure a case of food poisoning by encouraging the patient to keep eating the contaminated food. The logic was tragically flawed, but it was the only logic they had. The home itself could be a trap. Heavy curtains and carpets trapped dust, mold, and bacteria. Windows were often kept shut for fear of miasmas or noxious vapors from the street, leading to poor ventilation that allowed germs to circulate freely. A child playing on a rug could inhale mold spores or bacteria left behind by a sick family member. The mother, in her efforts to create a warm and comfortable home, was inadvertently cultivating an environment where illness could flourish. Food preservation was another source of invisible poison. Without refrigeration, meat, milk, and other perishables spoiled quickly. Mothers did their best to judge the freshness of food by sight and smell, but they had no way of detecting the presence of bacteria like salmonella or botulism. A piece of meat that seemed perfectly fine could be teeming with toxins. A child who ate it could develop a raging fever and stomach cramps within hours. The mother, having eaten the same meal, might fall ill herself, leaving no one to care for the suffering child. What stays with me most is the profound helplessness of it all. A mother trying to nourish her family, to keep them clean and safe, was constantly fighting a war against an enemy she could not see and did not understand. Her daily actions, cooking, cleaning, giving a child a drink of water, were filled with invisible risks. She was not poisoning her children out of malice or even neglect in the modern sense. She was doing so by following the accepted domestic practices of her time. The silence around these issues was profound. When an outbreak of typhoid swept through a neighborhood, it was seen as a mysterious plague, an act of God. People did not connect it to the shared water pump at the end of the street. A doctor might be called, but he would often prescribe useless tonics, or ironically, laudanum to quiet the patient's suffering, doing nothing to address the root cause. The mother was left to watch her child weaken and often die, feeling a sense of failure and grief, but never truly knowing why. This form of poisoning was perhaps the most insidious of all, because it was embedded in the very fabric of daily life. It was not a single act, but 1,000 small repeated actions. It was the water in the cup, the milk in the pitcher, the dust in the air. The Victorian mother, for all her hard work and devotion, was trapped in a system of ignorance that turned her most loving gestures into potential acts of harm. Her home, meant to be a haven, was filled with hidden dangers, and the poison she administered was not in a bottle, but in the very elements of survival. And while she fought these invisible battles, she was also tasked with passing down the wisdom of her generation to her daughters, a wisdom that was itself a form of poison, a poison of silence and ignorance, that would leave them just as vulnerable as she was. Beyond the physical poisons that permeated the Victorian home, there was another, more subtle toxin that mothers passed to their daughters, the poison of silence. In a society that defined female virtue by modesty, innocence, and a profound ignorance of the body, mothers were tasked with raising their daughters to be pure. This purity, however, was achieved by withholding essential knowledge about their own health, anatomy, and the realities of the world. A mother taught her daughter to be quiet, to be obedient, and to never, ever speak of what happened to her own body. This enforced ignorance disguised as protection left girls utterly unprepared for the physical and emotional challenges of womanhood, making them vulnerable to disease, exploitation, and the very same cycles of harm their mothers had endured. The silence began early. A young girl was taught that her body was something to be covered and concealed. Questions about where babies came from were met with vague fairy tale answers. The onset of menstruation was often a terrifying and shameful surprise, with mothers offering only a few whispered inadequate instructions and a pile of rags. The message was clear. What was happening to her was private, slightly disgusting, and not to be discussed. This created a profound sense of alienation from her own physical self. It is almost absurd that a culture so obsessed with family and lineage considered basic biological knowledge to be a moral contaminant. A girl was raised to be a future wife and mother, yet she was taught nothing about the mechanics of reproduction, childbirth, or her own menstrual cycle. This silence was a form of poison because it stripped her of agency. When she inevitably faced health issues, painful periods, infections, or the complications of pregnancy, she had no language to describe her suffering and no framework for understanding it. She would simply endure it in silence, just as her mother had, believing her pain was a normal, unchangeable part of being a woman. This inheritance of ignorance had deadly consequences. Without an understanding of how their bodies worked, young women could not protect themselves. They didn't understand how diseases were transmitted. A mother, herself uneducated, could not warn her daughter about the dangers of certain behaviors or relationships. The innocence that was so prized was in fact a state of profound vulnerability. A daughter was sent into the world armed with rules of etiquette, but with no knowledge of self-preservation. In modern terms, it would be like sending a child out into the world without ever teaching them about traffic, germs, or strangers, simply because you believed that knowledge of danger would corrupt their purity. The silence extended to mental and emotional health. A mother conditioned to suppress her own feelings of anxiety, frustration, or sadness taught her daughter to do the same. A girl who expressed strong emotions was often scolded for being unladylike or hysterical. She learned to wear a mask of calm composure, burying her true feelings deep inside. This emotional suppression was a poison to the spirit. It created a generation of women who were disconnected from their own inner lives, unable to ask for help or even to identify what they were feeling. When they inevitably struggled, society had a label ready for them: hysteria. And the cure, of course, was often laudanum, thus continuing the cycle of sedation that had trapped their mothers. I find it deeply sad to imagine a mother looking at her daughter, loving her fiercely, and yet believing that the greatest gift she could give her was a profound lack of knowledge. The mother was not being cruel. She was being obedient to the social codes of her time. She was passing down the only model of womanhood she knew, one defined by silence, submission, and a willful turning away from the truths of the body. This poison of silence ensured that the same mistakes were repeated. A daughter who knew nothing of hygiene would fall victim to the same infections as her mother. A daughter who knew nothing of the dangers of cosmetics would paint her face with the same lead-based powder. A daughter who was taught that her pain was something to be endured quietly would reach for the same bottle of laudanum when life became too much to bear. The mother, in her effort to raise a proper daughter, was inadvertently preparing her for a lifetime of silent suffering. The home became a classroom where the primary lesson was erasure. A girl's curiosity was erased, her emotional expression was erased, and her connection to her own body was erased. She was taught to be a vessel for the expectations of others: her father, her husband, her society. This was the ultimate poison, the denial of self. It didn't kill the body as quickly as arsenic or opium, but it slowly starved the soul. The mother was the first and most trusted teacher of this lesson. She taught it not through lectures but through her own example, through her sighs, her silences, her averted eyes, and her quiet acceptance of pain. A daughter watched, learned, and imitated. The poison was passed not in a spoon, but in a glance, not in a bottle but in a tradition of unspoken truths. This legacy of ignorance was perhaps the most effective poison of all, for it ensured that the other more literal poisons would continue to be used, trusted, and passed down as mothers and daughters, bound by a shared and crippling silence, faced a world they were never taught to understand. And reinforcing this entire system were the twin pillars of Victorian society, the doctor and the advertiser, who together convinced mothers that all these forms of poison were not just safe, but necessary. The Victorian mother did not operate in a vacuum. Her decisions were shaped, guided, and often dictated by two of the most powerful forces of her time, the medical establishment and the burgeoning world of advertising. Together they created a persuasive and inescapable narrative that framed poison as care, sedation as safety, and a mother's obedience as her greatest virtue. Doctors, overwhelmingly male and steeped in the belief of female inferiority, saw women's bodies as inherently flawed and prone to a mysterious condition called hysteria. This diagnosis was a convenient catch-all for anything from menstrual pain and anxiety to simple expressions of frustration. The cure they offered was almost always the same: rest, quiet, and a prescription for laudanum. A mother, trusting the authority of the man in the crisp shirt with the medical bag, would accept the bottle without question. She was not just receiving medicine, she was receiving validation that her suffering was real, even as the cure was a poison that would only deepen it. It is grimly ironic that the figures of authority meant to protect health were the primary distributors of the substances that destroyed it. A doctor would prescribe laudanum to a new mother for postpartum pain, advise her to give a soothing syrup to her crying infant, and see no contradiction. He was not necessarily malicious. He was a product of his time, armed with a limited understanding of addiction and a deep-seated belief that a quiet woman was a healthy woman. He turned mothers into the unwitting instruments of a system that valued compliance over well-being. They became the final link in a chain of poison that began in a doctor's office. While doctors provided the authority, advertisers provided the reassurance. The pages of newspapers and women's magazines were filled with cheerful, elegant ads for Mother's Friend, Godfrey's Cordial, and countless other opium-laced syrups. These ads featured beatific images of sleeping babies and serene mothers. The language was gentle and persuasive, using words like harmless, natural, and doctor-approved. For a mother plagued by doubt, these advertisements were a powerful comfort. They told her she was not alone and that a solution was not only available but respectable. In modern terms, it would be like if pediatricians and social media influencers teamed up to promote a new brand of calming cookies for toddlers, without ever mentioning that the active ingredient was a powerful sedative. The trust would be implicit, and the danger would be invisible. Manufacturers of these products understood their audience perfectly. They knew that a mother's greatest fear was being seen as a failure. Their advertising preyed on this anxiety, suggesting that a good mother was one whose home was peaceful and whose children were well behaved. The syrup was presented not as a drug, but as a tool for achieving this domestic ideal. By purchasing the bottle, a mother felt she was buying not just medicine, but also competence and social approval. The poison was wrapped in the promise of good motherhood. The silence of the medical and commercial worlds was deafening. There were no warning labels on the bottles, no public health campaigns, and no government regulations. A manufacturer could put a lethal amount of morphine in a teething syrup and face no legal consequences. A doctor could foster a patient's addiction for years and never be held accountable. This lack of oversight created a perfect environment for the epidemic to flourish. The mother was trapped in a web of misinformation, where every trusted source, her doctor, her newspaper, her local chemist, told her the same lie. I find it profoundly frustrating how trust was weaponized against these women. They were conditioned to defer to male authority and to believe what they read in print. This obedience, once again, became their undoing. They followed instructions faithfully, poisoning themselves and their children, because the most respected voices in their society told them it was the right thing to do. This system turned mothers into both victims and perpetrators. They suffered from the effects of the drugs themselves, their health and vitality slowly draining away. At the same time, they were the ones who administered the poison to their children, their hands guided by a system of lies. When tragedy struck, when a child died from an overdose, or a mother slipped into a state of permanent delirium, the system protected itself. The death was blamed on the woman's weakness or the child's frailty. The doctor expressed his condolences. The chemist sold another bottle, and the advertisement continued to run. The mother was left with the grief and the unspoken guilt, never fully understanding that she had been a pawn in a much larger game. The story of how Victorian women poisoned their children is not just a story of a dangerous drug. It is the story of how an entire society can collude in a form of mass delusion, where profit and control are valued more than human life. The mother was not the source of the poison. She was merely its final delivery system. The true poison lay in the silence of the medical establishment, the greed of the manufacturers, and the profound systemic dismissal of women's pain and intelligence. They were armed with bottles and told it was love, and in a world that offered them few other tools, they had little choice but to believe it. The story of the Victorian mother and the poisons that filled her home is a dark and complex tapestry, woven from threads of love and ignorance, trust and betrayal. From the opium-laced syrups used to quiet crying infants, to the lead-based powders transferred with a kiss, the dangers were ever present, hidden in the most ordinary rituals of domestic life. These women were not villains. They were the products of an era that demanded their silence and praised their submission, an era that armed them with poison and called it medicine. They were caught in a tragic paradox, striving to be good mothers within a system that made it almost impossible to do so without causing harm. The soothing syrups that promised a peaceful night's sleep instead delivered addiction and too often a final irreversible silence. The breast milk that should have provided life-giving nourishment became a conduit for the narcotics a mother took to endure her own suffering. The cosmetics that created a mask of pale, respectable beauty carried heavy metals that stunted a child's growth and mind. And the very silence that was held up as a feminine virtue, the refusal to speak of the body, of pain, of fear, was a poison in itself, allowing these cycles of harm to repeat, generation after generation, unchallenged and unseen. These were not isolated accidents. They were the predictable outcomes of a society that refused to equip women with knowledge, that dismissed their pain as hysteria, and that valued the appearance of order over the reality of well-being. The true poison was not merely the opium in the bottle or the lead in the powder. It was the pervasive belief that a quiet child was a good child and a subdued woman was an ideal woman. The medical establishment, the advertisers, and the weight of social expectation all conspired to turn the Victorian mother into an unwitting accomplice in the suffering of her own children. She was the first victim, and she was the final agent. What is most haunting is that she acted out of love, a love that was manipulated and misguided by the trusted authorities of her time. The legacy of these practices is written in the unmarked graves of countless infants and in the quiet, diminished lives of those who survive. It is a chilling reminder that the greatest dangers are often the ones we are told not to question, the ones wrapped in promises of safety and endorsed by the silence of the crowd. May the stories of these women and their children not be forgotten. May their silent suffering finally be heard. And may we remember that true care is built not on silence and submission, but on knowledge, honesty, and the courage to question what we are told is best. Good night, and sleep well.